In November 1918, the German Empire surrendered. Curiously, the German army had not been decisively defeated on the battlefield. At the moment of the armistice, German troops still occupied portions of France and Belgium. While their spring offensive had stalled, the military machine remained largely intact and was theoretically capable of sustaining the conflict for months, if not years. So, why did they lay down their arms? The answer lies in the 800,000 German civilians who had starved to death. These deaths were not caused by aerial bombardment or infantry fire. They were the result of a relentless British naval blockade that severed Germany's connection to global trade, systematically starving the population into submission. This marked a pivotal moment in modern history, the first time a major world power was defeated not by traditional military might, but by the cold efficiency of economic warfare. Britain fought this war using finance, trade embargoes, blacklists, and naval dominance. They transformed the entire global economy into a weapon of mass destruction. This strategy became the definitive blueprint for every economic sanctions regime we see today. The modern SWIFT banking system, which cuts entire nations off from international finance, is essentially the 1918 British financial blacklist updated with computers. The sanctions currently leveled against Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and North Korea are simply the 1918 blockade enforced with legal paperwork instead of warships. The maximum pressure campaigns that impoverish civilian populations to force regime change are a direct echo of what Britain did to Germany. That original campaign claimed the lives of 800,000 people, most of whom were women, children, and the elderly. This history matters to you in 2025 because the economic warfare system birthed in World War I has evolved into the primary weapon of modern conflict. And you are living inside its blast radius. When the United States sanctions a foreign power, your access to global markets changes. When a nation is disconnected from SWIFT, the prices you pay for basic goods shift. When trade wars escalate, your cost of living spikes. The system designed to starve Germany 107 years ago is the same invisible architecture that determines whether you can afford groceries, gasoline, and housing today. Over the next 25 minutes, I will show you exactly how Britain weaponized the global economy in World War I, how their economic blockade killed more Germans than actual combat did, and how this created the template for modern sanctions, measures that have since killed millions worldwide. Understanding this is not an academic exercise in history. This is the origin story of the financial control system you inhabit. It is a world where money is a weapon, trade is a battlefield, and civilian populations are the primary targets. To understand the present, we must first correct what we were taught in school. We were told that World War I was a story of trench warfare, poison gas, and machine guns. While those elements were real, they are an incomplete picture. The war that actually decided the outcome was economic. It was a war of resources, industrial capacity, and access to the global marketplace. Britain did not win the war in the muddy trenches of France, they won it in the financial heart of London and across the shipping lanes of the Atlantic. In 1914, most expected a war of quick mobilization and decisive battles. However, by December of that year, the conflict had reached a stalemate. The Western Front froze into a line of trenches stretching from Switzerland to the North Sea. Both sides soon realized that victory would not be won by tactical brilliance or individual bravery alone. It would be won by whoever could sustain industrial-scale warfare the longest. The winner would be the side with the most steel, the most oil, the most food, and the most credit. In this regard, Britain possessed a massive advantage, the Royal Navy. With over 300 major warships, Britain controlled the European seas entirely. Germany's navy was formidable but smaller and effectively trapped in the North Sea. On November 2, 1914, just 3 months into the conflict, Britain declared the entire North Sea a military area. They announced that any ship entering or leaving German ports would be stopped, searched, and seized if it carried anything useful to the German war effort. This was the inception of the Hunger Blockade. While naval blockades were centuries old, the scale and totality of the British effort were unprecedented. They didn't just block munitions, they blocked everything. Food, medicine, fertilizer, and raw materials were all seized. Britain utilized geography to its advantage, patrolling the narrow channels of the North Sea 24/7. If a neutral merchant ship from Norway, Denmark, or the Netherlands attempted to trade with Germany, British warships would intercept it. Boarding parties would inspect the cargo, and anything on the contraband list was confiscated. Initially, this list included weapons and explosives, but by 1915, it had expanded to include food, metals, chemicals, rubber, cotton, and leather. Britain argued that in a total war, there was no distinction between a soldier and a civilian. If a civilian is fed, they can work in a munitions factory. If a farm has fertilizer, it can grow food for the front lines. Therefore, everything was a legitimate target. This was the birth of total economic warfare, the idea that starving a population is a valid military strategy. The results were devastating. By 1915, Germany, which had imported 25% of its food before the war, was running out of staples. The most critical blow, however, was to their agriculture. Modern farming requires nitrogen fertilizer, which Germany imported as nitrates from Chile. The blockade severed this supply. Without fertilizer, crop yields plummeted by 30% to 50%. Germany attempted to synthesize nitrates domestically using the Haber-Bosch process. While this allowed them to create explosives to keep the war going, they couldn't produce enough for both bombs and bread. They chose the bombs. This was the cruel choice the blockade forced upon them: feed the army or feed the people. Germany chose the army, and the civilians paid the price. By the winter of 1916 to 1917, known as the turnip winter, food shortages became catastrophic. Turnips, normally reserved for livestock, became the primary food source for millions. Bread was rationed to a mere 6 ounces a day. Meat, butter, and milk virtually disappeared. People survived on substitutes: coffee made from acorns, sausage filled with sawdust, and bread made from ground chestnuts and potato flour. The malnutrition was horrific. Children stopped growing, infant mortality rates soared, and common illnesses became death sentences for weakened bodies. By 1918, hospitals were overflowing with children dying from starvation-related complications. Crucially, the blockade did not end when the fighting stopped. When the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, Britain maintained the blockade for 8 more months until the Treaty of Versailles was signed in June 1919. During those 8 months of peace, another 100,000 Germans starved to death. Britain used the threat of starvation as leverage to ensure Germany accepted every harsh term of the treaty. The final death toll of the blockade reached approximately 800,000 civilians. It was not collateral damage, it was a calculated strategy to break the national will. Beyond the ships, there was a financial dimension. Before World War I, the global economy ran on the gold standard and the British pound. London was the world's financial capital. Britain weaponized this dominance by creating the statutory list, or the blacklist. This was a roster of companies and individuals in neutral countries suspected of trading with Germany. If you were blacklisted, British firms were forbidden from doing business with you. You were cut off from British banks, and more importantly, British insurance. Since Britain dominated the global marine insurance market, a blacklisted ship could not get insurance, which meant it could not sail. Britain pressured neutral nations by threatening to cut off their access to British coal and credit if they didn't comply. This was the precursor to modern sanctions. It was a private commercial decision, in name, but a government-mandated weapon in practice. This is exactly what the U.S. does today through the OFAC sanctions list. It is the 1918 system, digitized for the 21st century. Germany's response to this strangulation created the second half of modern economic warfare, unrestricted submarine warfare. Desperate to counter the blockade, Germany used U-boats to sink merchant ships supplying Britain. In February 1915, they declared the waters around Britain a war zone. This led to the sinking of the RMS Lusitania, where 1,198 people died, including 128 Americans. While this strategy nearly starved Britain in 1917, it ultimately brought the United States into the war. American entry provided the Allies with a massive infusion of industry, food, and credit, making Germany's defeat inevitable. By November 1918, with a starving population and a collapsed economy, the German Empire folded. After 1918, the world's powers realized that economic warfare was more effective and less politically costly than traditional combat. They institutionalized it. The League of Nations tried it against Italy in 1935. After World War II, the United Nations codified it under Chapter 7. Throughout the Cold War, the U.S. used it against Cuba and the Soviet Union. In the modern era, we see this 1918 playbook used with surgical precision. In 2012, the U.S. and EU cut Iranian banks off from SWIFT and prohibited oil exports. Iran's economy contracted by 20%, its currency lost 80% of its value, and medicine shortages killed thousands. The nuclear program continued, but the civilians suffered. Following the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Ukraine, Russia was largely cut off from SWIFT, and $300 billion in central bank reserves were frozen. While Russia adapted by trading with the global south, the sanctions caused European energy costs to spike by 400%, leading to the deindustrialization of German industry. Starting in 2017, the U.S. froze Venezuelan assets and prohibited oil sales. The economy collapsed by 75%, hyperinflation destroyed the currency, and an estimated 40,000 people died due to sanctions-related causes. The government remained in power, the people paid the price. You cannot escape this system because sanctions affect everyone, not just the target. There are four main mechanisms. Supply disruptions *. When a major producer like Russia or Iran is sanctioned, global supply drops and prices for oil and gas spike at your local pump. Market fragmentation *. Companies can no longer source the cheapest materials, they must buy from approved, but more expensive sources. These costs are passed on to you. Currency devaluation *. When the U.S. freezes a nation's dollar reserves, other countries stop trusting the dollar and move toward gold or the yuan. As demand for the dollar falls, its value drops, making everything you import more expensive. Taxpayer burden *. Your taxes often fund the subsidies or aid required to help allies navigate the fallout of these economic wars. The human cost is staggering. The UN sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s are estimated to have caused 500,000 excess deaths, mostly of children. In North Korea, sanctions have contributed to famines that killed hundreds of thousands. In Yemen, the U.S.-supported blockade has created the world's worst humanitarian crisis. If sanctions almost never achieve their stated policy goals, failing in Cuba, North Korea, Iran, and Russia, why are they still used? First, they allow politicians to look tough without the political risk of sending soldiers to die. Second, they serve specific economic interests, for example, U.S. gas companies profit when Europe is forced to stop buying Russian gas. Third, they are a tool of empire maintenance, designed to enforce the U.S.-led financial order. However, this weapon is now backfiring. By weaponizing the dollar, the U.S. has incentivized the rest of the world to build alternatives. China has CIPS, Russia has SPFS, and the BRICS nations are moving toward a shared currency. The very system used to maintain dominance is now accelerating the shift toward a multipolar world. By 2030, the dollar's status as the sole reserve currency may be over. When that happens, the power to sanction will vanish, and with it, the financial empire built on the 1918 model. To prepare for this fragmenting world, you must, 1. Diversify your currency *. Do not hold only dollars, consider gold, or other diversified assets. Anticipate inflation *. Sanctions-driven supply shocks are the new normal. Reduce debt and build a resilient savings plan. Recognize the blocks *. Understand that the global market is splitting into competing economic zones. Your financial future depends on navigating the origins of this control system, a system where money is the ultimate weapon of war. The global landscape is now fracturing into distinct, competing spheres. On one side, you have the Western Bloc, led by the United States, Europe, and their traditional allies. Opposing them is the Eastern Bloc, anchored by China, Russia, and Iran. Meanwhile, the global South is playing both sides, refusing to commit to either as they seek their own advantage. To survive this era, you must learn to navigate a world defined by parallel, often clashing, economic systems. Fourth, you must recognize that the tools of international sanctions will eventually be turned inward. If a government possesses the power to freeze the assets of a foreign nation or blacklist international companies, they possess the infrastructure to do the same to their own domestic political opponents. Consider the precedent set by Canada in 2022, an observer might point out. The government froze the bank accounts of trucker convoy protesters without a second thought. The machinery of economic warfare is being repurposed for domestic control. You need to prepare for a reality where your financial access is tied to your political alignment. Let me bring this to a conclusion with a brutal, historical truth. In November 1918, Great Britain essentially won World War I by starving 800,000 German civilians to death through a relentless naval blockade and total financial isolation. This was not a side effect of the conflict, it was the core strategy. The strategy worked exactly as intended. Germany surrendered not because its military was decisively defeated on the field, but because its people were dying of hunger at home. This tragedy created the blueprint for modern economic warfare. Every sanction, blacklist, asset freeze, and trade embargo used today is a direct descendant of the 1914 to 1918 British blockade model. In the century since, these tools have been used hundreds of times, killing millions of civilians while almost never achieving their stated policy objectives. Yet, the system persists because it serves other masters, domestic political theater, corporate profit, and the desperate maintenance of global empire. You cannot escape this system. When countries are sanctioned, you pay the price through inflation and higher costs. When foreign reserves are frozen, the stability of your own currency is undermined. When global trade fragments, your standard of living drops. The economic warfare system established in the trenches of World War I is the very system you live inside today. And now, that system is accelerating toward a collapse. The United States has weaponized the US dollar so aggressively that the rest of the world is working overtime to build viable alternatives. We are approaching a tipping point, likely by 2030, where the tool of sanctions may lose its power entirely. But until that day comes, you remain trapped inside an economic weapon designed 107 years ago to starve civilian populations into submission. If this has clarified the origins of the financial control system that governs your life, subscribe immediately. Our next video will dive into how the post-dollar world will actually function once sanctions no longer work and the empire built on economic warfare finally falls apart. The pattern from the Great War is undeniable: economic warfare may win the battle, but it ultimately destroys the empire that wields it. Britain won the war, but in doing so, they lost their empire. America is currently on that same path, and the remaining timeline is likely only 5 to 10 years. The blockade that once killed 800,000 Germans evolved into the sanction system that controls your life today. Now, that system is in the process of destroying itself. Welcome to the reality of economic warfare. You aren't just watching it happen, you are living inside the weapon.